Canada march against mass immigration.
The time has come for decisive action.
Disaffected Canadians here who feel like the government has not been listening to them.
Canadians from all across this great country sent a clear message tonight. It's time for a change in this country, my friends.
I believe in God. I believe you have to love your neighbor as you love yourself.
Absolutely, having people come up and talk.
Yeah.
Giving a chance and letting there be silence when people talk. But when you're screaming over everybody else, nothing's going to happen.
Canada, a land of diversity, freedom, and promise, now finds itself at a crossroads. Tonight, dueling demonstrations erupt on the streets of Toronto. Anti-immigration protesters chant for slower borders. Counter-protesters roar back, "Not in our park, not in our community." Police in riot gear step in, 10 arrested, violence captured, shared, and replayed millions of times online. At the same time, Parliament drafts new hate crime laws. Social media floods with graphic videos too horrific for children to see, yet impossible to escape. And beyond Canada's borders, Russian drones test NATO skies while culture wars stir even in our parks and festivals. What does all of this mean for a country built on multiculturalism? What future lies ahead for Canada and for us all? Tonight, we begin that story. The sun had barely dipped below the skyline of Toronto when the chants began. Canada's largest city, often celebrated as one of the most multicultural places on Earth, found itself echoing with tension. Two rallies, two visions of Canada's future, and one unavoidable collision. On one side, marchers carrying flags and placards proclaiming Canada First. They moved through Christie Pitts Park with conviction, saying they weren't opposed to immigration, but that it had grown too fast, too unchecked, too overwhelming for their communities. "I'm not saying no to immigrants," one organizer told cameras. "I'm saying we need to slow it down. We need to protect our culture, our identity, our history." On the other side, louder, angrier voices. Counter-protesters gathered in the very same park, chanting "No racist." Not in our park, not in our community. To them, the Canada First rally wasn't about protecting culture. It was about exclusion, division, and a dangerous revival of ideas long thought buried. For some, the choice of Christie Pitts carried deep symbolism, the site of a 1933 riot rooted in anti-Jewish hatred. They had come not just to shout down a march, but to prevent history from repeating. As the two groups edged closer, Toronto police formed a living wall between them. But walls bend, walls break. And when the Canada First march spilled into the streets, it took only minutes before fists flew, signs shattered, and the evening descended into confrontation. Riot officers, tactical units, heavily armed squads, police closed Bloor Street, shutting down one of the city's main arteries. By nightfall, at least 10 people were in handcuffs. Social media flooded with shaky videos of the clashes, each clip fueling anger, each share magnifying division. This was no longer a rally. It was a reflection of something larger, a nation in conflict with itself. Once the genie of rage and resentment is out of the bottle, can it ever be forced back in? To understand why tensions boiled over in Toronto, you have to look beyond the chants and the barricades. Immigration has always been part of Canada's identity. It is written into the very fabric of its cities, its economy, its promise. But today, that promise feels strained. The numbers alone tell the story. Canada issued more than 437,000 study permits last year, nearly double what it had granted a decade ago. More than 850,000 international students now call Canada home. At first, this was celebrated: fresh ideas, cultural diversity, and crucial labor for an aging population. But housing markets buckled. Cities like Vancouver and Toronto gasped under the pressure of soaring rents and vanishing availability. Families asked, "Where do we live when every basement suite is snapped up?" Workers wondered, how do wages keep up when the cost of living outpaces paychecks? In December, Ottawa struck back with new rules. The financial proof requirement for students doubled to $21,000. Study permits were capped. Unapproved college programs lost their eligibility for work visas, The once popular Student Direct Stream, which fast-tracked visas from 14 countries, was scrapped. For thousands of hopefuls, one misplaced form or a missing comma could now mean rejection. And no group has felt this shift more than India. Once the largest source of students to Canada, accounting for 41% of all international enrollments, Indian applications are now being denied at staggering rates. Nearly 8 in 10 rejections. Students who dreamed of Canadian classrooms are left staring at stamped refusals. For families who had borrowed, saved, and prayed for opportunity abroad, it feels like betrayal. In coffee shops, on campuses, in immigrant neighborhoods, the whispers grow. Has Canada closed its doors? Supporters of stricter policies argue it's necessary, an act of survival in a country drowning in housing shortages. Critics call it scapegoating, punishing young dreamers for a crisis rooted in policy failures. Somewhere in the middle lies the Canadian public, increasingly torn between empathy and exhaustion. And so, the Toronto clashes are more than noise. They are the sound of a country wrestling with a profound question. Can Canada remain the world's champion of multiculturalism when its own foundations are shaking? Every protest tells two stories, the one shouted by its organizers and the one shouted back by those who refuse to stay silent. Toronto was no different. The counter-protesters that day weren't just activists. They were teachers, students, shopkeepers, survivors of past battles against fascism and hate. For them, Canada First's slogans rang with dangerous familiarity. The ghosts of the 1930s, when fascist rallies ignited violence across North America, hovered over the crowd. One protester told reporters, "I want to keep the fascists down." They were everywhere in the 30s. They grew powerful then. We can't let them get that powerful again. The chants were raw. Not in our park, not in our community. It wasn't simply about disagreeing with immigration policy. It was about drawing a red line, saying this city, this neighborhood, would not host rallies that divided neighbors against neighbors. Encircled by counter-protesters, the Canada First group marched anyway, insisting on their right to free speech. The police barrier became a fragile dam, holding back decades of unresolved fears about identity, culture, and belonging. These confrontations, captured on viral videos, spilled into every corner of social media. Each clip became ammunition in a larger war of narratives. To some, it was proof that ordinary Canadians were finally standing up against uncontrolled immigration. To others, it was evidence that the far right had gained a foothold in the country's most diverse city. And to most, it was simply unsettling, a glimpse of what happens when policy debates turn into personal battlegrounds. But history tells us one truth. When hate and hope collide in the public square, the echoes never fade quickly. They ripple. They transform politics, reshape communities, and force nations to confront the kind of future they want to build. After the smoke cleared from the protests in Toronto, the conversation shifted from the streets to the halls of power. In Ottawa, Prime Minister Mark Carney's government prepared to act, promising to table a new bill against hate crimes and intimidation. The idea was simple. No Canadian should fear entering a synagogue, mosque, temple, or community center. No child should hesitate to walk into their school because of threats. But in politics, simple ideas often become complicated. The bill proposed 3 new criminal code offenses: willful intimidation, obstruction of access to community spaces, and a standalone hate offense. Supporters called it overdue, a way to give police sharper teeth when confronting hate-fueled protests. Critics, however, warned it skirted a delicate line, protecting vulnerable communities without criminalizing free speech. Bernie Farber, a veteran of Canada's anti-hate efforts, applauded the move, but voiced frustration. "We're talking about hate in the streets," he said, "but online? Silence." For him, the digital battlefield where threats multiply and radicalization spreads remains under-policed. The legislation, he argued, was a shield with cracks. Still, the symbolism mattered. For a government facing rising hate crimes, nearly double the rate since 2020, The law was an attempt to show leadership, a promise to minority Canadians that their fears were heard, that their safety mattered. But promises on paper don't always translate to safety on the ground. And outside Parliament, protests continued. In today's world, battles aren't fought only in streets or legislatures. They play out on screens, in classrooms, and inside our homes. The killing of conservative activist Charlie Kirk drove that truth home in brutal detail. The video of his final moments, graphic and bloody, ricocheted across TikTok, Snapchat, and YouTube within hours. Millions watched, including children. At one Toronto school, a teacher allegedly showed a portion of the video to a grade 5 class. The backlash was immediate. The teacher was suspended, parents were horrified, and the country asked, how do we stop this torrent of violence from reaching our kids? The problem is that social media has no borders, no walls, and very few effective gatekeepers. Once a video is uploaded, it becomes part of an endless chain, reshared, re-uploaded, reframed. Warnings can be bypassed with a click. Curiosity, peer pressure, or the need to stay in the conversation drive kids to watch, even when they don't want to. Psychologists warn that repeated exposure to graphic violence desensitizes empathy. The more blood, the more horror we see, the less we react. For children, the impact can be permanent, reshaping how they view conflict, human suffering, even themselves. Parents like Rebecca Snow now refuse to give their children smartphones before age 14. "I can't risk it," she said. "I can't compete with TikTok and YouTube." It's a parental rebellion, but also an admission. Once the genie is out of the bottle, it's nearly impossible to force it back in. While Canada wrestled with protests and online violence, storm clouds gathered overseas. In Eastern Europe, Russian drones violated NATO airspace, buzzing into Poland, drifting over Romania. French fighter jets scrambled, intercepting machines that shouldn't have crossed the line. Each drone was small, but each incursion carried an enormous weight. If a single drone had struck NATO soil, would the world be plunged into war? Into this tension stepped Donald Trump, demanding action not just against Russia, but against China. His call: impose 50 to 100% tariffs on Chinese goods until the war ends, and cut off China's purchase of Russian oil. To his supporters, it was a bold stance. To analysts, it was political theater. The bar was set so high it might never be reached, and caught in the middle was Canada. Too small to dictate global policy, too exposed to ignore it. Canada's economy depends on both US and Chinese trade. Its security depends on NATO solidarity. But can a middle power survive when superpowers collide? Analysts warned Canada has less than 2 years to adapt, or risk standing alone in a world where alliances fracture and old rules vanish. Far from NATO skies, another storm brewed, not over drones, but over wands. In Vancouver, Stanley Park prepared to host the Harry Potter Forbidden Forest experience, a magical attraction where families could wander among glowing lanterns, costumed characters, and enchanted creatures. Tickets sold quickly, excitement filled the city. But not everyone felt the magic. A city councillor called for its cancellation, citing author J.K. Rowling's controversial statements on transgender issues. How, she asked, can Vancouver profit from someone accused of fueling transphobia? For her, the Forbidden Forest wasn't a playground, it was a platform for harm. Fans disagreed. For them, Harry Potter was a story of resilience, friendship, and hope, divorced from the politics of its creator. Parents wanted to share the wonder with their children. Critics argued that canceling art because of its author was censorship. Supporters insisted that allowing the attraction ignored the pain of marginalized groups. The debate became less about wizards and more about values. What does it mean for a multicultural, inclusive city to host or cancel an event tied to a polarizing figure? In the Forbidden Forest, Canadians weren't just arguing over fantasy. They were grappling with the real-world question: whose voices matter most in the spaces we call community? Not all cultural battles end in anger. In Prince Edward Island, The SOMO festival unfolded with sun, seafood, and song. Crowds poured in, bracelets scanned, eager to see stars like Alanis Morissette. For many, it was a chance to breathe, to dance, to forget politics and crises, even if just for a night. But even festivals carry drama. Rising TikTok star Alex Warren, fresh off his MTV win, canceled his appearance due to exhaustion. Fans, some of whom traveled across provinces to see him, were furious. His apology video went viral, with 20 million views. Festival organizers called it a miscommunication. Replacement acts filled the stage, and the music carried on. Beneath the glitter and guitars lay a truth. Culture is more than entertainment. It's economic lifeline. Festivals pump millions into local economies. Hotels, restaurants, vendors thrive. In small communities, they bring the world to their doorstep. But when stars cancel or controversies erupt, the ripple is felt not just by fans, but by entire towns. Back in Manitoba, the front lines of another battle were far from celebratory. At Winnipeg's Health Sciences Centre, Canada's largest hospital, doctors and nurses reported rising violence, threats, assaults, even knives drawn. A survey revealed that nearly half of physicians had experienced physical intimidation in the past year. The province responded with a drastic move, stationing police officers inside the hospital permanently. For some, it was relief. For others, a troubling sign of how dangerous healthcare has become. Nurses spoke of being punched, shoved, screamed at. Doctors warned of burnout, fear, and trauma. Healthcare has always been stressful, but something has shifted. Overcrowded emergency rooms, long waits, frustrated families. Anger often lands on the very people trying to save lives. For a profession built on compassion, facing daily hostility is unbearable. They deserve to be safe, one advocate said. If they aren't safe, neither are the patients. Police inside hospitals may keep order in the short term, but long-term solutions, addressing understaffing, improving mental health supports, investing in patient care, remain elusive. Canada's healthcare workers, once seen as heroes, now fight battles not only against illness, but against violence itself. In Newfoundland and Labrador, hundreds of small towns prepared for elections, but in many communities, the races ended before they began. Only one candidate stepped forward, often by default. Mayoral positions, once symbols of civic pride, now felt like burdens no one wanted to carry. Local politics had grown toxic. Long hours, little pay, constant scrutiny, and rising public hostility. Researchers warned this wasn't just apathy, it was a democratic crisis. If fewer citizens are willing to serve, the very foundation of representative government weakens. In a province proud of its resilience, the silence of empty ballots spoke louder than any protest. Beyond protests and politics, Canada's voice was heard on a very different stage. Hollywood. Cinematographer Jessica Lee G, raised in Quebec City, broke barriers as the first woman to win an Emmy for her work on Severance. Her story reflected another side of Canada, the creative export, the quiet but powerful influence of its artists shaping global culture. While politicians debated hate crime laws and protesters clashed in the streets, Jessica's lens reframed dystopia and hope for millions worldwide. Her success was more than personal. It was a reminder that Canada's contributions are not confined to parliament or protests, but are also woven through art, storytelling, and imagination. Together, these stories reveal a country in tension. Immigration protests test the promise of multiculturalism. Legislation seeks to answer rising hate, but critics demand more. Social media floods young minds with violence faster than parents can protect them. Global pressures squeeze Canada between powerful allies and adversaries. Cultural debates expose divisions over identity, while local elections falter under apathy. And yet, through festivals, art, and grassroots movements, Canadians still seek connection, joy, and meaning. Canada stands at a crossroads between openness and fear, progress and paralysis, hope and despair. The choice of direction lies not only with leaders, but with every citizen. As the credits roll on this moment in time, one truth remains. Canada's story is not simple. It is a mosaic of protests and promises, failures and triumphs, crises and celebrations. In Toronto, chants still echo, not in our park, not in our community. In Ottawa, bills are drafted to tame hate. In hospitals, nurses steady trembling hands after another night of threats. And in living rooms, parents wrestle smartphones from their children's grasp. This is Canada, fragile, fiery, flawed, and yet full of possibility. The question is not whether the storm will pass, but what kind of country will emerge when it does.